At 9:36 in the evening, my phone rang with a call that would permanently fracture my family. A trembling woman whispered into the receiver, telling me to save my grandson right now, or it would be too late. I rushed to my daughter's house with my heart pounding against my ribs, but my son-in-law blocked the front door with a cold, dead stare and told me the boy was simply asleep. It was only when I looked past his shoulder into the dimly lit living room that my blood ran cold with absolute horror. Within 72 hours, he would be sitting in a federal interrogation room begging me for a deal while I legally dismantled his entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father never stops protecting his family, no matter how old they get. I am 63 years old, and I spent 4 decades working as a senior auditor for commercial banks. My entire career was built on finding the hidden discrepancies, the forged signatures, and the missing funds that desperate people try to conceal. I know what a lie looks like on paper, and I know what a lie looks like on a man's face. When the caller ID flashed Monica, I instantly knew the perimeter had been breached. Monica was the night nanny I personally paid for to help my daughter Natalie with her 4-year-old son Leo. Natalie had been suffering from severe migraines and exhaustion, balancing her demanding career with a failing marriage. I wanted to ensure she had professional support at home. Monica was a seasoned pediatric nurse, not a woman prone to panic or exaggeration. I answered the phone on the first ring. Monica did not say hello. Her voice was a frayed, frantic whisper that shook so violently the syllables cracked. She told me I needed to get to the house right now. She said I had to save Leo before it was too late. Before I could ask a single question, I heard a loud, heavy thud in the background, followed by the immediate click of the line going dead. I did not try to call her back. Calling back wastes time and alerts the enemy. I grabbed my keys, walked out into the cold October rain, and got into my truck. The drive from my house to Natalie's suburban neighborhood usually takes 20 minutes. I made it in 9. The slick roads and the sharp turns did not register in my mind. My brain was already cataloging the variables. A sudden disconnection meant intervention. A panicked nurse meant a medical emergency or an immediate physical threat. I pulled onto their quiet, tree-lined street, and the first alarm bell went off in my mind. The exterior of Natalie's house was completely dark. The porch light was off. The motion sensors in the driveway had been manually disabled. I let my truck coast to a stop on the street right in front of their property, killing the engine and the headlights to avoid casting a beam across their windows. I stepped out into the rain and observed the garage. The heavy wooden door was raised about 3 feet off the concrete. Underneath that gap, I could see the rear bumper and the exhaust pipe of Brian's sports utility vehicle. He had backed the car straight into the garage. You do not back a large vehicle into a tight garage on a random Tuesday night, unless you are preparing to load something heavy and you want to ensure a rapid, unobserved exit. I walked up the concrete path to the front porch. I did not ring the doorbell. I pounded my fist against the heavy oak door with enough force to rattle the hinges. 10 seconds passed in total silence. I raised my foot, preparing to kick the deadbolt out of the frame. Then the lock clicked. The door opened exactly 4 inches. Brian stood in the gap. He was wearing a heavy water-resistant winter coat, zipped all the way to his chin. It was barely 50 degrees outside, completely inappropriate for a heavy coat inside a heated house. A sharp chemical odor washed over me immediately. He smelled strongly of industrial bleach, layered with a cheap, overpowering cologne. Brian forced a flat, emotionless smile that did not reach his eyes. He kept his right hand firmly on the brass doorknob and pressed his left shoulder against the doorframe, creating a solid, physical barricade. He told me it was late and that they were all sleeping. I looked him dead in the eye and commanded him to move out of my way. His grip tightened on the knob until his knuckles turned white. He told me the boy was asleep. He claimed Natalie had a severe migraine, took her heavy medication, and finally passed out. He accused me of waking the whole neighborhood with my pounding. I am not a man who argues with a brick wall. I am an auditor. I bypassed his face and let my eyes adjust to the darkness behind him. Through the narrow gap between his arm and the doorframe, I scanned the living room. The first anomaly was the luggage. 4 heavy, hard-shell suitcases sat neatly aligned by the bottom of the staircase, fully packed and zipped. Brian was a man who traded on his charm, spending the last 5 years bouncing between failed tech startups, always using Natalie's steady income to fund his illusions of grandeur. I never trusted his polished smiles. Real men build foundations. Parasites look for hosts. The packed bags told me the parasite was preparing to detach. The second anomaly was the safe. Natalie's fireproof document safe, which she usually kept locked in the upstairs office, was sitting on the floor rug. The heavy steel door had been violently pried open. The inside was completely empty. You do not pry open your own safe unless you have lost the combination. And you do not empty it unless you are taking the passports, the birth certificates, and the social security cards for a permanent relocation. Then my eyes found the leather sofa in the center of the room. Leo was sitting there, but he was not sitting normally. My 4-year-old grandson was slumped forward, his chin resting flush against his chest at an unnatural, severe angle. His left arm hung completely limp, brushing against the hardwood floor. A child who falls asleep watching television eventually shifts or adjusts their posture. Leo was perfectly still. The rise and fall of his chest was so shallow, it was almost imperceptible. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind became a fortress of ice. Seeing my grandson looking like a discarded rag doll triggered a primal rage that I had to violently suppress. I wanted to break the glass, put my hands around Brian's throat, and squeeze until that cheap cologne was the last thing he ever smelled. But rage makes you sloppy. Strategy makes you lethal. Brian realized I was no longer looking at him. He shifted his weight, changing his stance to block my line of sight, preparing to slam the door shut. If I pushed my way inside, there would be a physical altercation. Brian was younger and heavier. Even if I won the fight, he would immediately call the police and report a violent home invasion. I would be arrested for assault on his property. I would be placed in the back of a squad car while he finished loading the vehicle and disappeared into the night with my drugged family. I needed overwhelming authoritative force, and I needed it instantly. I looked back at Brian and instantly dropped my aggressive posture. I let my shoulders sag and let a look of tired submission wash over my face. I took a slow, deliberate step backward off the porch mat. I told him I was sorry for the intrusion. I said I would come back tomorrow morning and asked him to tell Natalie to call me when her headache cleared. Brian blinked, visibly surprised by my sudden retreat. He relaxed his shoulder just a fraction. He agreed to pass on the message and wished me a good night. He slammed the door shut, and I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated a worried old man. He did not realize that I had just gathered the exact intelligence I needed to legally annihilate him. I turned my back to the house and walked calmly down the driveway. I did not look back. I did not run. I walked to my truck, opened the door, and climbed inside. I locked the doors and pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I did not call 911. A standard dispatch would send a single patrol car to knock on the door. Brian would play the role of the concerned husband, point to my erratic behavior, and ask them to leave. I needed a tactical entry. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed a direct number I had kept saved for 12 years. It belonged to Captain Reynolds, a veteran precinct commander whose pension fund I had personally rescued during a massive bank fraud investigation a decade ago. Loyalty, in my experience, is the only currency that never depreciates. The line connected on the second ring. I told Captain Reynolds I needed an immediate unannounced tactical welfare check at my daughter's address. I stated there was a suspected hostage situation, a suspected drugging of a minor, and that the suspect was actively loading a vehicle for an international flight. I rolled my window down slightly, letting the cold rain hit my face. The trap was set. The predator inside that house thought he was the smartest man in the room. He had no idea that an auditor does not just look for the crime. An auditor secures the exits, traps the thief, and seizes everything they love. I put the truck in drive, pulled down to the end of the cul-de-sac, and waited in the darkness for the sirens. The rain battered the windshield of my parked truck as I sat in absolute darkness at the end of the cul-de-sac, watching the driveway. I had already spoken to Captain Reynolds, but I knew municipal ambulances were subject to strict dispatch queues and triage protocols. I could not afford even a 10-minute delay when my grandson's life was fading on that couch. I pulled my phone out again and contacted a private medical transport firm heavily utilized by the elite clients of my former bank. I authorized a $5,000 emergency retainer to guarantee an immediate intensive care unit level response. In my 4 decades of tracing hidden corporate assets, I learned that money buys speed, and speed saves lives. 5 minutes later, 2 silent police cruisers rolled onto the wet street without their flashing lights or sirens. Right behind them was the sleek black van of the private medical team. I stepped out of my truck and met the officers on the wet pavement. I did not need to explain the situation twice, because Captain Reynolds had briefed them perfectly. They moved with quiet military precision up the concrete walkway toward the house. There was no polite knocking and no verbal warning. The lead officer drove a heavy tactical battering ram directly into the thick oak door. The wood splintered instantly, and the deadbolt tore completely free from the frame. I walked through the shattered entrance merely seconds behind the armed entry team. The sharp smell of bleach and cheap cologne still hung heavy in the hallway air. Brian was standing near the bottom of the staircase, looking completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming force. An officer immediately shoved him face first against the drywall and secured his hands tightly behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. Brian began screaming about his civil rights and an illegal home invasion. I ignored his pathetic voice completely. I walked straight past him to the leather sofa. The private paramedics were already swarming my 4-year-old grandson. Leo had not moved a single inch since I first looked through the door. One paramedic gently lifted the boy's head, while the other shined a harsh penlight directly into his eyes. The paramedic announced that the pupils were severely dilated and entirely unresponsive to the light. He pressed 2 fingers against the boy's neck and stated the heart rate was dangerously depressed. They moved with terrifying efficiency, lifting his limp body onto a portable stretcher and securing an oxygen mask over his small, pale face. I watched my grandson breathe beneath the clear plastic mask and felt a cold, absolute fury settle deep in my bones. I turned to the second police officer and demanded to know where my daughter was located. The officer pointed toward the top of the stairs. I took the steps 2 at a time, ignoring the burning in my knees. The master bedroom door was wide open. Natalie was lying flat on her back, perfectly centered on the mattress. She was fully dressed in her professional work attire. Her face was turned slightly toward the window, revealing a massive dark purple contusion blooming across the left side of her jaw. A brutal physical strike had clearly preceded whatever chemical agent she had been forced to ingest. I walked closer to the wooden nightstand. An empty bottle of heavy prescription sleep aids sat perfectly aligned next to a half-empty glass of water. It was a meticulously staged scene designed to look exactly like a desperate mother intentionally overdosing and taking her child with her. A second team of paramedics rushed into the bedroom and immediately began checking her vital signs. They called out that she had a faint pulse but was completely unresponsive to severe pain stimuli. They secured her onto a rigid backboard and carried her out. I walked back down the stairs to the living room. Brian was sitting on the hardwood floor, struggling against his restraints. He saw me approaching and immediately changed his defensive tactic. He started crying loudly, claiming Natalie had suffered a sudden psychotic break, fed the boy her pills, and swallowed the rest herself. He shouted that he was simply packing their bags to take them to a private psychiatric facility to protect her professional reputation. I walked over to him and looked down. I asked him why a man trying to save his suicidal wife would pry open her fireproof safe and steal her birth certificate instead of dialing emergency services. Brian immediately stopped his fake crying. His eyes narrowed and he told the police officers that he was the husband and he held the legal medical proxy. He loudly demanded that they remove me from his property. I calmly reached into the inside breast pocket of my coat and withdrew a laminated, heavily stamped legal document. I handed it directly to the commanding officer. 3 years ago, when Brian first started showing subtle signs of financial instability, I convinced Natalie to sign an irrevocable medical and legal directive. The document named me as her sole proxy in the event of incapacitation, explicitly superseding her marriage license. The officer read the document carefully, nodded at me, and told Brian to shut his mouth. The illusion of absolute control that Brian had relied upon to execute his plan was evaporating right in front of him. I left Brian on the floor with the arresting officers and followed the private ambulances out the door. I drove closely behind them as they raced through the rainy streets toward Memorial Hospital. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of bright fluorescent lights and rushing nurses. They wheeled Natalie and Leo into separate restricted trauma bays. I stood firmly in the center of the observation corridor, refusing to sit down in the waiting area. A young attending physician wearing dark green scrubs approached me, holding a digital tablet. He looked exhausted and deeply annoyed by my unyielding presence in the restricted zone. He casually informed me that they were pumping their stomachs and administering standard reversal agents for a suspected generic sedative overdose. I looked the doctor in the eye and told him I required a full comprehensive toxicology screen drawn immediately for both my daughter and my grandson. The physician shook his head and patronizingly explained that standard hospital protocol for an obvious overdose did not require a full-spectrum blood analysis. He claimed it was an unnecessary financial expense and that they already knew she took sleep aids based on the empty bottle found at the scene. I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with the absolute calculated authority of a man who destroys corporate careers for a living. I told him the empty bottle was a staged prop left by a man attempting a double homicide. I explained that standard reversal agents would never document the exact chemical compounds, the exact dosages, or the precise time of administration. I told him I needed a verified, unbroken chain of custody for the blood samples to ensure the results were fully admissible in a federal court of law. The doctor bristled at my tone and rigidly stated he would not waste critical hospital resources on a paranoid conspiracy theory. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up to his face. I informed him that I was the legal proxy, and if he refused a direct medical demand for a comprehensive toxicology screen, I would have my attorney file a massive malpractice lawsuit against his medical license before the sun came up. I promised him I would personally audit every financial record his department had produced in the last 5 years and find every single billing error he had ever made. The doctor stared at me slowly, realizing I was not a grieving, emotional father he could easily dismiss. I was a legitimate, dangerous threat to his entire livelihood. He swallowed hard, turned sharply on his heel, and shouted at the nursing staff to prep the comprehensive legal toxicology kits. I stood by the glass doors and watched the nurses draw the dark red blood from my grandson's tiny arm into the secure, tamper-proof vials. The medical evidence was now permanently locked in. The police had the suburban house locked down. But as I stood there in the sterile, quiet hallway, the mind of the auditor began to turn again. Brian was a coward. Cowards do not drug their entire family and pack their passports simply because they are unhappy in a marriage. They run when they are utterly terrified. They run when a massive, crushing weight is about to drop directly on their heads. Brian was trying to leave the country tonight. Fleeing across international borders permanently requires a massive amount of liquid capital. I realized with sudden absolute clarity that the physical attack on my daughter was merely the symptom. The real crime was entirely financial, and the county records office would open in exactly 7 hours. I left the hospital just as the sun began to rise over the city. The sky was the color of bruised iron, matching the cold, heavy feeling in my chest. I drank a cup of bitter black coffee from a vending machine and got back into my truck. I did not drive home to rest. Rest is a luxury for men who are not at war. I drove straight to the downtown municipal building and parked my truck in the empty visitor lot. I sat in the cab, listening to the engine cool, and waited for the county records office to open at 8 o'clock sharp. My mind was completely focused on the timeline. Brian had staged a fake suicide and packed 4 suitcases. The police had detained him at the hospital for preliminary questioning regarding the drugs found in his house. But questioning would only hold him for a few hours. He would play the victim. He would cry and deflect. I needed undeniable paper evidence of his criminal intent before the police decided to let him walk out the front doors. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the municipal building unlocked. I walked inside and bypassed the information desk. I spent 40 years tracking hidden assets. I knew the layout of county registry offices better than most of the clerks who worked there. I went directly to the property records division on the 3rd floor. There was no line. I walked up to the counter and handed the clerk a slip of paper with Natalie's home address and parcel identification number. I asked for a complete printing of the title history, the current deed, and any liens or encumbrances filed within the last 90 days. The clerk was a young man who looked half asleep. He typed the information into his terminal and hit print. A thick stack of paper slid out of the machine. I paid the $20 public records fee and took the documents to a quiet reading table in the corner of the room. I spread the papers out across the wooden table. I ignored the original purchase documents from 7 years ago. I flipped straight to the recent activity log. My eyes scanned the columns of dates and financial figures. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. There it was. A massive, glaring anomaly stamped right in the middle of the page. Exactly 4 days ago, a second mortgage had been placed against the property. The amount was for $400,000. I traced my finger across the page to identify the lender. It was not a traditional commercial bank. Traditional banks take 30 to 60 days to underwrite a loan of that size. They require appraisals and income verification and in-person signatures. This loan was issued by a private equity firm operating out of Nevada. They were a predatory hard money lender known for processing high-risk equity loans in less than 48 hours. They charged exorbitant interest rates, but they provided immediate liquid cash. The pieces of Brian's cowardly puzzle began snapping together with terrifying clarity. He had drained all the equity out of the house my daughter worked tirelessly to maintain. But a massive discrepancy remained. Natalie was the primary owner of the house. I was listed as the secondary guarantor on the original deed because I had provided the down payment. There was absolutely no legal way Brian could encumber the property with a new mortgage without both of our physical signatures. I walked back up to the clerk. I gave him the document filing number for the new mortgage and told him I needed to see the exact authorization paperwork attached to this specific loan. The clerk clicked his mouse a few times and told me the loan was executed using a durable power of attorney. He printed the supplementary documents and handed them to me. I returned to the table and examined the power of attorney. It was dated 2 weeks ago. The document claimed to grant Brian total unilateral control over Natalie's real estate assets and financial accounts. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the page. It was supposed to be Natalie's signature, but the loops were entirely wrong. The pressure of the ink was uneven. It was a pathetic, desperate forgery. Then I looked at the secondary signature line. My own name was signed right below hers, supposedly waiving my rights as the guarantor. I stared at the forged version of my own handwriting. Brian had actually believed he was smart enough to forge the signature of a senior bank auditor. He thought he could steal $400,000 right out from under me and vanish before anyone noticed the missing funds. I checked the notary stamp next to the forged signatures. The stamp belonged to a former business associate of Brian's, who had lost his real estate license a few years prior. Brian had found a corrupt notary willing to authenticate fake signatures for a cut of the stolen money. The entire narrative shifted. Brian was not a stressed husband having a breakdown. He was a calculated domestic terrorist. He had secured the $400,000 loan 4 days ago. Hard money lenders wire the funds directly to the designated bank account immediately upon receiving the signed documents. The money was already sitting in an account somewhere waiting to be moved. That was why Brian had drugged Natalie and Leo last night. He did not want to kill them. He wanted to incapacitate them. He needed them completely unconscious, so Natalie could not check her phone or log into her banking app while the massive wire transfer cleared. He needed 24 hours of absolute silence to finalize his escape. The 4 suitcases were packed because he was leaving the country the moment the bank opened today. He was going to leave his heavily sedated wife and child behind to face the foreclosure and the financial ruin he had secretly orchestrated. I gathered the papers and stacked them into a neat pile. I had the absolute proof of mortgage fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny right in my hands. The local police were currently questioning Brian about domestic violence and prescription drugs. They had no idea they were holding a man who had just stolen nearly $500,000. I folded the documents and placed them inside my coat pocket. I needed to act immediately, but I could not go to the local police with this yet. White-collar financial crimes take months for local detectives to investigate and prosecute. If I handed this to the police now, Brian would simply hire a defense attorney and bond out of jail while the courts dragged their feet. If he bonded out, he would immediately transfer the stolen money into an untraceable offshore account and disappear. I walked out of the records office and stepped back into the cold morning air. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to find out exactly where that $400,000 was currently sitting. I needed to intercept the money before it crossed international borders. I pulled my phone from my pocket and prepared to make a call to the fraud department of the largest commercial bank in the city. The predator thought he had secured his prize. He was about to find out what happens when you try to steal from a man who built the banking security systems you are trying to break. I drove away from this county records office with the forged mortgage documents burning a hole in my coat pocket. The financial motive was locked in, but I needed the physical timeline of the attack. I called Monica while navigating the morning traffic. The night nanny answered immediately, sounding exhausted and terrified. I told her to meet me at a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from the hospital and far away from my daughter's neighborhood. I needed to know exactly what she saw before the line went dead last night. I arrived at the diner 15 minutes later. Monica was already sitting in a back booth nursing a cup of black tea. She looked pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the ceramic mug. She was a seasoned pediatric nurse who had worked in emergency rooms before transitioning to private care. She was not a woman who panicked over a dropped plate or a crying child. Something had deeply unsettled her long before she made that desperate phone call. I slid into the booth across from her and told her the police had Brian in custody and that Natalie and Leo were alive and receiving medical treatment. A heavy sigh of relief escaped her chest, but her eyes remained dark with anxiety. Monica reached into her purse and placed a small silver flash drive on the scratched Formica table. She kept her hand over it for a moment as she spoke. She told me that Brian had been acting increasingly erratic over the past 3 weeks. He had fired the weekly cleaning service without consulting Natalie, and he had started locking the door to his home office. But the most alarming red flag appeared 2 days ago. Monica arrived for her evening shift and noticed the primary security panel in the hallway was completely dark. Brian told her the system was undergoing a remote software update and would be offline for 48 hours. Monica knew that was a lie. Security companies do not leave luxury homes completely unmanoted for 2 days without sending a technician. She realized Brian was creating a blind spot in his own house. She did not know what he was planning, but her protective instincts kicked in. On her way to work the next evening, she stopped at an electronics store and purchased a high-definition hidden camera disguised as a standard digital clock. She placed it on the bookshelf in Leo's playroom, angling the lens to capture both the play area and the open doorway leading into the master bedroom. The camera was motion-activated and synced directly to a private cloud server on her phone. She told me she never intended to spy on them, but she needed an independent record just in case Brian tried to accuse her of negligence to cover up his own behavior. Last night, she logged into the cloud server from her own apartment just before her shift began. She wanted to check if Leo was asleep before she arrived. What she saw on the live feed terrified her so much, she immediately called my number. I took the silver flash drive from the table and slid it into my pocket. I thanked Monica for her incredible bravery and promised her she would never have to deal with Brian again. I paid for her tea and walked back out to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat and locked the doors. I pulled my laptop from my briefcase and rested it on the center console. I inserted the flash drive and opened the video directory. There were dozens of short clips triggered by motion, but I sorted them chronologically and clicked on the file time-stamped at 4:30 yesterday afternoon. The screen flickered to life, showing the bright, colorful playroom. Brian walked into the frame. He was carrying a dark green canvas duffel bag. He walked past the toy boxes and stepped into the master bedroom. The camera angle caught his reflection in the large vanity mirror. I watched him open Natalie's heavy wooden jewelry box. He did not grab things randomly. He was methodical. He ignored the costume jewelry and went straight for the high-value pieces. He took the diamond tennis bracelet I bought her when she graduated college. He took her grandmother's antique pearl necklace. He took a pair of sapphire earrings. He dropped them all into a velvet pouch and shoved the pouch deep into the duffel bag. This was grand larceny executed with absolute cold precision. He was liquidating small, untraceable assets to fund his immediate escape. The next video file was time-stamped at 6:15 in the evening. Natalie arrived home from work looking completely exhausted. She dropped her briefcase in the hallway and walked into the playroom to hug Leo. Brian followed her into the room, acting perfectly normal. He smiled and asked her about her day. He told her he had just brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee and offered to bring her a mug to help with her migraine. Natalie smiled gratefully and sat on the floor to play with her son. Brian walked out of the frame toward the kitchen. The camera audio picked up the sounds of cabinets opening and silverware clinking. A minute later, Brian returned holding a large ceramic mug, but he did not hand it to her immediately. The camera caught him standing in the doorway, his back turned slightly toward Natalie. He pulled a small plastic bag from his pocket. He took 2 heavy white pills and crushed them against the doorframe using the back of a metal spoon. He scraped the white powder directly into the dark coffee and stirred it quickly. He walked over and handed the mug to my daughter. I sat in my truck watching a silent digital screen as a man intentionally poisoned my child. Natalie took a deep sip of the coffee. She made a slight face complaining that it tasted unusually bitter. Brian laughed softly and told her it was a new organic roast he picked up from the local market. He stood right over her watching intensely as she drank the rest of the cup. The footage continued to run. 15 minutes later, Natalie began to sway. She rubbed her temples and told Brian the room was spinning. Her speech was already slurring. Brian feigned concern and helped her stand up. He guided her into the master bedroom and laid her down on the mattress. The moment her head hit the pillow, he walked back into the playroom. He picked up Leo's small juice box. He pulled another pill from his pocket, broke it in half, and shoved the pieces down the plastic straw hole. He handed the juice to my grandson and told him to drink up. I closed the laptop and placed my hands on the steering wheel. My knuckles were completely white. My breathing was slow and shallow. The urge to drive to the police precinct, walk into the interrogation room, and beat Brian to death was a physical ache in my chest. But violence is the weapon of the undisciplined. I had the forged mortgage documents proving the financial motive. I now had high-definition video evidence proving premeditated grand larceny and attempted murder. I could hand this flash drive to Captain Reynolds right now, and Brian would be locked in a federal holding cell by noon. But the mind of the auditor forced me to look at the larger board. If Brian was arrested today, his defense attorney would immediately freeze his assets to protect his estate during the trial. That meant the $400,000 he stole from my daughter would be locked in legal limbo for years. Natalie would have to fight a massive banking institution to clear the fraudulent mortgage off her property while recovering from physical trauma. I could not allow that. I had to recover the stolen funds before the trap snapped shut on his neck. Brian had secured the loan 4 days ago. He was waiting for the perfect window to wire the money offshore. That window was supposed to be this morning while his family was unconscious. He did not know I had the documents or the video. He only knew he was currently being questioned for domestic violence. The moment the police let him make a phone call, he would contact his bank and authorize the international wire transfer. I started the engine of my truck. The police could wait. The legal system could wait. I was going to intercept that wire transfer and tear his financial lifeline to shreds. I pulled out of the diner parking lot and headed toward the financial district. The predator was about to learn that there is always a bigger monster in the dark. I drove my truck into the heart of the financial district just as the morning rush hour began to choke the city streets. The sky was still heavy with gray clouds from the overnight storm, but the towering glass and steel structures of the commercial banking center gleamed in the dull light. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the First Global Commerce Bank. This was the massive institution where I had spent the last 15 years of my career before my retirement. I knew the security protocols, the hidden access corridors, and the exact location of the executive suites. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped onto the polished marble floor of the main lobby. The familiar scent of expensive leather and industrial floor wax washed over me. The young security guards did not recognize me, but the older guard stationed by the private elevators certainly did. He smiled and reached out to shake my hand, asking how I was enjoying my retirement. I gave him a brief, polite smile and told him I needed to see the senior vice president of fraud prevention immediately. He nodded and swiped his master key card to grant me access to the secure elevator. The elevator doors opened onto the 50th floor. This was the nerve center of the bank where global transactions were monitored and massive corporate accounts were heavily guarded. I walked past the reception desk, ignoring the surprised look of the young assistant, and pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the corner office. Sitting behind the massive mahogany desk was Colin. 20 years ago, Colin was a nervous junior analyst who barely knew how to read a balance sheet. I had personally mentored him, trained him to spot the invisible discrepancies in offshore accounts, and promoted him through the ranks. Now he was the senior vice president of the entire fraud division. He looked up from his computer monitor, and his eyes widened in surprise. He stood up quickly to greet me, but the smile faded from his face the moment he saw my expression. He knew me well enough to recognize the cold, calculated look of an auditor who had just found a massive bleeding wound in a ledger. He closed his office door and asked me what was wrong. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pulled the forged mortgage documents from my coat pocket and spread them out flat across his pristine desk. I told him that my son-in-law, Brian, had drugged my daughter and my grandson last night, leaving them unconscious while he attempted to empty their assets and flee the country. Colin looked completely horrified, but he remained silent and listened as I pointed to the forged signatures on the power of attorney. I explained that Brian had used a corrupt notary to secure a hard money loan against my daughter's house for $400,000. The loan had been funded 4 days ago, and the cash was sitting in an account waiting to be moved. I looked Colin directly in the eye and told him I needed to find out if the money had touched his banking network. If Brian was trying to move nearly $500,000 internationally, he would have to route it through a major clearinghouse. Colin did not hesitate for a single second. Loyalty in the banking world is rare, but when you build a man's career from the ground up, he remembers who holds the foundation. He sat back down in his leather chair and unlocked his secure terminal. He asked me for Brian's social security number and full legal name. I recited the information from memory. Colin's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard customer service portals and diving straight into the deep architectural framework of the global routing system. The screen reflected a harsh blue light against his glasses as lines of financial data scrolled rapidly down the monitor. He told me that Brian had indeed opened a shadow checking account with their bank exactly 1 week ago. The account had been completely empty until yesterday afternoon, when a massive inbound wire transfer cleared from a private equity firm in Nevada. The amount was exactly $400,000. Colin continued to dig through the transaction history, and suddenly his breath caught in his throat. He pointed to a flashing yellow indicator at the top right corner of his screen. He told me that Brian was actively attempting to move the entire balance right now. A high-priority international wire transfer had been initiated just 12 minutes ago. I leaned over his shoulder and read the destination details on the monitor. The money was being routed to a numbered corporate account in Belize. Belize is a notorious offshore banking haven, with incredibly strict banking secrecy laws and absolutely no extradition treaty with our government for financial crimes. If that money successfully landed in the Belize account, Brian would be completely untouchable. He could live the rest of his life in tropical luxury, while my daughter faced a devastating foreclosure and total bankruptcy. I asked Colin where the wire was currently holding in the system. He explained that large international transfers require a multi-stage verification process to comply with federal regulations. The funds had left Brian's shadow account, but they were currently sitting in the bank's central, holding queue, waiting for a final algorithmic clearance before being released to the global SWIFT network. Once it hit the SWIFT network, it was gone forever. The yellow indicator meant the transfer was still pending, but it could turn green and clear at any moment. I asked Colin if he could cancel the transaction outright. He shook his head and said that without a federal court order or a signed police warrant, he did not have the unilateral authority to seize the funds of a private citizen. The police were currently holding Brian for questioning regarding domestic violence, not financial fraud. We did not have time to get a judge to sign a warrant. I stood up straight and buttoned my coat. I told Colin we did not need a judge because we had the Federal Elder Financial Exploitation Act. I reminded him that I was 63 years old. My name and my personal capital were firmly attached to the original property deed that Brian had fraudulently encumbered. Under the strict guidelines of federal banking regulations, if a senior citizen is the suspected victim of financial exploitation, the bank is legally obligated to freeze the disputed assets immediately pending a full internal investigation. This law was designed to protect elderly individuals from scammers, but today it was going to be the absolute destruction of my son-in-law. I pointed to the forged power of attorney on the desk and told Colin that the document was my official sworn affidavit of elder abuse. I instructed him to trigger the federal freeze protocol right now. Colin understood the legal maneuver perfectly. It was a flawless application of the banking code. He typed a rapid sequence of commands into the terminal. He bypassed the automated clearing system and manually flagged the $400,000 transfer with a red priority code for suspected elder financial abuse. The yellow flashing light on the screen instantly turned to a solid dead red. The transfer was completely paralyzed. The money was now legally trapped in a frozen internal holding account. Brian could not access it, and the bank in Belize would never receive it. The funds would remain entirely locked until I personally authorized their release, or until a federal court unraveled the fraud. I asked Colin what Brian would see on his end. Colin tapped the screen and explained that Brian was most likely using the mobile banking application from the police station, pretending to contact his lawyer, while secretly trying to confirm his escape fund. Colin manually altered the external notification system. He told me that on Brian's phone the transaction would simply say, "Pending security review." Brian would have no idea that the money was actually frozen under a federal fraud investigation. He would sit in that police precinct, sweating and staring at his screen, believing that his tropical escape was just delayed by a slow server. He would hold on to that false hope, completely unaware that his financial parachute had just been completely shredded. I thanked Colin for his unwavering loyalty. I gathered the forged documents from the desk and returned them to my coat pocket. The most critical phase of the operation was complete. I had successfully severed Brian's lifeline. He was now a man with no money, no safe haven, and no leverage. He was completely broke and staring down the barrel of a massive criminal investigation. I walked out of the executive office and took the elevator back down to the lobby. I stepped out into the morning rain, feeling a profound sense of cold satisfaction. Brian thought he could discard my family and walk away rich. Now I was going to find out exactly why he needed that $400,000 so desperately, and I was going to use that debt to bury him permanently. I drove back to Memorial Hospital with the absolute certainty that Brian would walk through those sliding glass doors before noon. The local police had held him for exactly 4 hours. Because I had deliberately withheld the nanny cam footage and the forged mortgage documents, the detectives only had enough evidence to charge him with a minor domestic disturbance. He posted a minimal cash bond and walked out of the precinct entirely convinced he had outsmarted the system. He believed his offshore wire transfer was simply caught in a routine security delay. He thought he just needed to tie up one final loose end before he could board a plane and disappear forever. That loose end was his 4-year-old son. Fleeing the country with stolen money is a financial crime, but leaving a spouse behind to report a kidnapping triggers an immediate international manhunt. Brian needed Natalie to voluntarily sign away her parental rights. He needed her to surrender legal custody so his departure would look like a mutual separation instead of a federal abduction. I walked into Natalie's private recovery room on the 4th floor. The chemical sedatives were slowly wearing off, but she was still drifting in and out of a heavy medicated fog. She looked incredibly fragile against the stark white hospital sheets. I sat in the chair next to her bed and made a single phone call to my personal attorney, Vincent. Vincent was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in dismantling corrupt corporate structures. He was a man who viewed litigation not as a profession, but as a blood sport. I gave him the exact room number and told him to bring his briefcase. I also authorized him to contact the chief of hospital security and arrange a private detail for our floor. We were not going to rely on standard hospital protocols to protect my family. We were building an inescapable box. Vincent arrived 30 minutes later, accompanied by 2 large security guards wearing tactical vests. I instructed the guards to stand completely out of sight down the hallway until I gave the signal. Vincent and I stepped into the small private bathroom attached to Natalie's suite, leaving the main door slightly ajar so we could observe the room. The trap was set, and all we had to do was wait for the rat to smell the cheese. At exactly 11:15, the heavy wooden door to the hospital room pushed open. Brian walked in looking nervous and exhausted. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, but he had clearly tried to clean himself up. He was not alone. Right behind him was a short, balding man clutching a cheap leather briefcase. It was not the same corrupt notary who had signed the fraudulent mortgage documents. This was a new accomplice, likely someone Brian had found hovering around the bail bondsman offices near the courthouse. A man desperate enough to authenticate a signature on a medical floor for a few $100s in cash. Brian walked directly to the side of Natalie's bed. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not check her vital signs. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He leaned over my groggy daughter and spoke in a soft, highly manipulative whisper. He told her she was very sick and needed to rest for a long time. He claimed the hospital administration required her signature on some standard consent forms to authorize her continued treatment. He pulled a black pen from his shirt pocket and forcibly pressed it into her trembling hand. Natalie blinked her eyes heavily, struggling to focus on the text printed on the pages. She was entirely incapable of reading a single sentence, let alone comprehending a binding legal contract. Brian placed his hand over hers, physically guiding the pen toward the bottom of the page. I pushed the bathroom door wide open and stepped into the hospital room. Vincent stepped out right behind me. I did not raise my voice. I simply told Brian to take his hands off my daughter. Brian spun around so fast he nearly knocked over the intravenous drip stand. His face drained of all color the moment he realized he was not alone. The balding notary took a sudden step backward, clutching his briefcase tightly against his chest. Brian tried to recover his composure, forcing a pathetic smile and claiming he was just helping Natalie with her insurance paperwork. Vincent walked forward with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner. He did not address Brian. He looked directly at the trembling notary and asked him for his full legal name and his state commissioning number. Vincent informed the man that he was standing in a restricted medical facility attempting to secure a signature from a chemically impaired patient. He stated that if the notary did not hand over those documents immediately, he would personally ensure the man was indicted for conspiracy to commit fraud before the end of the business day. The notary did not hesitate for a single second. He practically threw the clipboard onto the foot of the bed, turned around, and bolted out of the hospital room without saying a single word. I picked up the clipboard and read the top page. It was exactly what I anticipated. It was a comprehensive waiver of all parental rights granting Brian sole physical and legal custody of Leo, but it went even further than that. The second page was a complete surrender of all marital assets, formally absolving Brian of any financial liability regarding the property or their shared debts. He was trying to force a drugged woman to sign away her child and her entire financial future while she lay in a hospital bed. I looked at Brian and felt a cold, absolute disgust. I told him his plan was entirely pathetic. I informed him that I already had a copy of the forged $400,000 second mortgage sitting in my truck. I told him I had the high-definition nanny cam footage showing him crushing the sedatives into Natalie's coffee. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror as the massive weight of his crimes suddenly became visible. He realized his entire secret operation had been completely exposed. Brian took a step toward the door, but Vincent stepped directly into his path. Vincent coldly explained that the local police might have let him walk out on a domestic charge, but the federal prosecutors would not be so lenient when they saw the evidence of grand larceny and mortgage fraud. Brian began to hyperventilate. The arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked frantically between me and the door, trapped in a room with two men who held the power to destroy his life. But Brian was a desperate parasite, and parasites always try to leverage their final remaining asset. He tried to puff out his chest and put on a brave face. He looked at me and sneered, stating that I could threaten him all I wanted, but he had the financial resources to drag this out in court for a decade. He claimed he was going to hire the best defense attorneys in the state and completely bankrupt my family in legal fees. He was still clinging to the absolute delusion that the $400,000 was safely waiting for him in the global banking network. He still believed he had the money to fight me. I let him hold on to that delusion. I did not tell him the wire transfer was permanently frozen. I wanted him to exhaust every single ounce of his energy, believing he had an escape route. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I pressed a single button, and the two large security guards stepped into the doorway, completely blocking the exit. I told the guards to escort Brian off the hospital premises and permanently ban him from the building. I warned Brian that if he came within 500 feet of my daughter or my grandson again, I would not call the police. I would simply hand the flash drive to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The guards grabbed Brian by both arms and physically marched him down the hallway. The hospital room fell silent. Natalie was drifting back to sleep, completely unaware of the war that had just been fought over her bed. Vincent took the fraudulent custody papers from my hand and placed them securely in his briefcase. He looked at me and asked what our next move was. I told him we had successfully blocked Brian's physical escape and his financial escape. But a man does not steal $500,000 and try to flee to Belize just because he is greedy. He does it because he is running from something much worse than a divorce. I looked at Vincent and told him we needed to find out exactly who Brian owed money to, because I was going to buy that debt and become his absolute worst nightmare. I drove back to my house with Vincent riding in the passenger seat. The hospital was secure, and Natalie was heavily guarded. I needed absolute silence to concentrate on the financial puzzle. We walked into my private home office and I locked the heavy oak door. I powered on my desktop computer and opened a secure encrypted browser. I pulled the routing data Colin had given me earlier that morning. The money Brian tried to steal was destined for a numbered corporate account in Belize. Belize is a fortress for dirty money, but every fortress has a structural flaw if you know exactly where to look. I poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed one to Vincent. I told him to pull up the international corporate registry databases he used during his time as a federal prosecutor. We spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing the routing digits against global holding companies. We hit a solid match just after 2:00 in the afternoon. The Belize account was registered to a shell corporation operating under the name Azure Oceanic Holdings. The name meant nothing, but the registered agent attached to the file triggered an immediate alarm in my mind. I recognized the agent from a massive money laundering audit I conducted 10 years ago. Azure Oceanic Holdings was not a legitimate shipping or logistics firm. It was a well-known financial front for an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent clarity. Brian had not lost all that money trying to fund legitimate technology startups. He had been secretly gambling on international sports for years. He was an addict who had finally borrowed too much money from the wrong kind of people. I picked up my phone and called a retired colleague who currently worked as an independent investigator for the State Gaming Commission. I read him the account numbers and asked him to leverage his underworld contacts to find out exactly how much a man named Brian owed to the Azure Group. My contact called me back 20 minutes later. His voice was grim. He told me Brian was currently in the hole for $450,000. The syndicate had officially called the debt due 3 days ago. They had given Brian exactly 1 week to deliver the cash, or they were going to start breaking bones. That was the absolute truth behind the 4 suitcases and the forged mortgage. Brian was not trying to escape a failing marriage. He was running for his life. The $400,000 he tried to steal from my daughter was meant to be a massive lump sum payment to keep the syndicate assassins away from his door. He was willing to leave his drugged wife and child completely destitute just to save his own skin. Vincent leaned back in his leather chair and took a slow sip of his scotch. He told me that since the money was frozen, Brian was practically a dead man walking. He suggested we just sit back and let the syndicate handle the trash. I looked at Vincent and shook my head. I told him that letting a cartel kill Brian was too easy, and it would leave my daughter tangled in a messy police investigation. I did not want Brian dead. I wanted him completely destroyed and legally enslaved to me for the rest of his natural life. I instructed Vincent to draft a comprehensive corporate assignment of debt contract. I told him to structure a new private holding company under my name, with the sole purpose of purchasing high-risk financial liabilities. Vincent stared at me in disbelief. He realized I was not going to pay off Brian's debt to save him. I was going to purchase the debt so I could become the new syndicate boss. I used my investigator's encrypted channel to reach out to the domestic intermediary for the Azure Group. These organizations always maintain local operatives to collect cash and enforce contracts. I received a text message an hour later, directing me to an exclusive private cigar lounge in the downtown commercial district. I put on a fresh suit and placed a certified cashier's check for $500,000 inside my leather briefcase. I told Vincent to stay at the house and wait for my call. I arrived at the lounge just as the sun began to set. The room was dark and smelled heavily of imported tobacco and expensive bourbon. A man wearing a tailored gray suit was sitting alone in a plush leather booth in the back corner. He did not look like a street thug. He looked like a hedge fund manager. I slid into the booth across from him and placed my briefcase on the table. The man introduced himself simply as Roman. He smiled a thin, cold smile and told me he was surprised to see a father stepping in to clean up such a massive mess. He assumed I was there to beg for a payment plan or offer a fraction of the total to spare my son-in-law's life. He pulled a thick manila folder from his jacket and placed it on the table. He tapped the folder and told me Brian was a pathetic degenerate who had completely exhausted their patience. I looked Roman directly in the eyes. I told him I did not come to beg, and I did not come to negotiate a discount. I told him I wanted to buy the entire portfolio. I opened my briefcase and slid the certified cashier's check across the table. The check was made out to his primary domestic holding company for $500,000. It was a $50,000 premium over what Brian actually owed. Roman stopped smiling. He looked at the check and then looked back at me with a new level of cautious respect. He asked me why I would pay a premium to acquire the worthless paper of a man who was already completely broke. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I told him that Brian had attempted to harm my family, and that standard legal punishment was insufficient for my requirements. I explained that if I owned the original promissory notes, I could legally garnish his wages, seize any future assets he ever acquired, and utterly ruin his life through the legitimate court system without breaking a single law. Roman understood the cold calculus immediately. The syndicate wanted cash, not a messy murder investigation. I was offering them guaranteed clean money at a profit. He picked up the cashier's check and inspected the watermark. He nodded slowly and pushed the thick manila folder across the table toward me. He told me the folder contained every digital signature, every recorded phone call, and every legally binding collateral agreement Brian had ever signed with their organization. I opened the folder and verified the documents. Brian had been incredibly stupid. He had signed comprehensive confession of judgment forms to get the credit lines. These documents were legal masterpieces of financial destruction. Brian had willingly surrendered his right to a trial or a defense in the event of a default. I could take these papers to a judge tomorrow morning and obtain an immediate sweeping garnishment order. If Brian ever managed to get a job, I would take half his paycheck. If he ever bought a car, I would have the sheriff tow it away. If he ever opened a bank account, the funds would be automatically frozen and transferred to my holding company. He was now a permanent financial slave to the man whose family he had tried to destroy. I placed the documents securely in my briefcase and locked the brass clasps. I closed my briefcase and stood up from the booth. Roman raised his glass of bourbon in a silent toast to a successful transaction. I did not return the gesture. I walked out of the dark lounge and stepped into the cool evening air. The transition was completely finalized. An hour ago, Brian was terrified of a faceless offshore cartel. He thought his biggest problem was finding a way to flee the country to avoid their enforcers. He had no idea that the cartel no longer owned his life. I owned his life. Every single cent of his massive crushing debt now belonged exclusively to me. I got back into my truck and placed the briefcase on the passenger seat. It was time to return to the suburban house and formally introduce Brian to his new absolute reality. I drove away from the downtown cigar lounge with the syndicate contracts securely locked inside my briefcase. The sky had darkened into a deep, starless black. My next objective was the suburban house. Brian had been banned from the hospital, but he was not in police custody. A desperate man with frozen bank accounts and a cartel breathing down his neck would inevitably return to his last known cache of valuables. He needed the canvas duffel bag filled with Natalie's diamond and sapphire jewelry to pawn for quick travel cash. I intended to be standing right there when he arrived. I parked my truck in the driveway and called a 24-hour emergency locksmith. The technician arrived 20 minutes later in a white panel van. I showed him my state identification and the original property deed, proving my legal authority to secure the premises. I instructed him to drill out and replace every single deadbolt on the exterior doors, including the garage access panel and the sliding glass doors on the back patio. I watched closely as the old brass locks were destroyed and heavy-duty steel cylinders were installed in their place. I paid him double his standard rate in cash to work quickly and quietly. By the time the locksmith drove away, the house was an impenetrable fortress of hardened steel and deadbolts. I did not turn on any interior lights. I pulled a wooden patio chair onto the dark front porch and sat down in the deep shadows cast by the overhanging roof. I placed two specific documents on my lap. The first was an emergency ex parte restraining order. Vincent had routed it through a family court judge earlier that afternoon, using the medical toxicology reports and the high-definition nanny cam footage as irrefutable evidence of imminent physical danger. The second document was a formal notice of default and immediate foreclosure. Since I had personally secured the first mortgage on the property, Brian's fraudulent second mortgage constituted a direct breach of the original lending covenant. I had the absolute legal right to seize total control of the estate and evict any unauthorized occupants immediately. I sat in the cold night air and waited. 2 hours passed in absolute silence. The neighborhood was completely still. Then the dull yellow headlights of a cheap rental car swept across the driveway. Brian had obviously abandoned his own luxury sports utility vehicle, fearing the police might have tagged the license plate in their system. He killed the engine and stepped out onto the cold concrete. He looked completely unhinged. His heavy winter coat was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His posture was hunched, and his movements were erratic and paranoid. He constantly checked over his shoulder, terrified that syndicate enforcers were tracking his movements through the dark streets. He walked up the front steps, completely unaware of my presence in the dark corner of the porch. He pulled a brass key from his pocket and shoved it into the newly installed front door lock. The key stopped halfway down the chamber. He jiggled it violently, cursing under his breath in a frantic whisper. He tried to force the cylinder to turn, but the new reinforced steel mechanism refused to budge a single millimeter. He hit the solid wooden door with the side of his fist in a sudden burst of panicked frustration. I spoke clearly from the darkness, telling him he was using the wrong key. Brian jumped back, nearly stumbling off the edge of the elevated porch. He squinted into the deep shadows as I slowly stood up and walked into the faint illumination of the distant street lamp. I did not hold a weapon. I did not need one. I held the 2 pieces of paper that were going to end his life as a free man. He tried to mask his sudden terror with manufactured outrage. He demanded to know what I had done to the locks on his house. He shouted that this was his legal residence and that I was committing a severe federal crime by denying him entry to his own property. He claimed he just needed to go inside to get a change of clean clothes and his personal duffel bag. I knew exactly what was hidden inside that green canvas bag. He was not looking for clean shirts or fresh socks. He was looking for a quarter of $1 million in stolen diamonds to buy a fake passport and a commercial bus ticket out of the state. I stepped closer to him, completely invading his personal space. I handed him the first document. I told him he was holding a court-ordered emergency restraining order signed by a superior court judge. I explained the exact parameters of the legal document. He was legally prohibited from coming within 1,000 feet of Natalie Leo, or the property line of this specific house. I told him that his current physical position on my concrete porch was a direct violation of a federal mandate. I informed him that if I dialed the police right now, he would be arrested without bail for violating a protective family order. Brian's hands shook violently as he stared at the embossed legal seal on the thick paper. The terrifying reality of his total isolation was finally crushing his arrogant delusions. He realized he could not simply bully or manipulate his way past me. But he was a parasite, and parasites always try to negotiate when they are hopelessly trapped in a corner. He dropped his voice to a pathetic, trembling whine. He begged me to just let him grab the canvas bag from the upstairs master bedroom. He swore on his life he would leave the state immediately and never contact my daughter again if I just gave him that one piece of luggage. I handed him the second document. I told him it was an immediate notice of foreclosure and eviction. I explained that I knew all about the corrupt notary and the forged power of attorney he had submitted to the county clerk. I told him the $400,000 second mortgage he fraudulently acquired was a complete violation of my original deed covenant. Because of his criminal financial actions, I had officially triggered the default penalty clause. The house no longer belonged to him in any capacity whatsoever. He was completely stripped of his residency and all his marital equity. He stared at the foreclosure notice, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. He stammered that I could not do this to him. He said he desperately needed the equity from the house to pay off a massive, crushing debt. He actually tried to play the victim, claiming that dangerous, violent people were looking for him, and that if he did not get the jewelry or the house money, he was a dead man. He looked at me with pathetic, pleading eyes, expecting me to feel a tiny shred of sympathy for the man who had casually poisoned my 4-year-old grandson. I looked at him with eyes made of absolute glacial ice. I told him the jewelry bag was no longer inside the house. I explained that the moment I secured the property, I removed the duffel bag from the bedroom. I told him the diamonds and sapphires belonged to my daughter, and they would never fund his cowardly escape. I then delivered the final devastating blow. I informed him that his offshore wire transfer to the corporate account in Belize had been completely frozen by the Federal Banking Commission under a priority elder abuse investigation. I watched the very last remaining drop of hope drain completely from his pale face. He finally understood the absolute totality of his defeat. He had zero access to the loan money, zero access to the stolen jewelry, and zero access to his family. Brian fell straight to his knees on the hard, cold concrete porch. He started sobbing openly, completely broken by the relentless sequence of calculated legal strikes. He cried that the Azure Syndicate was going to murder him in the street. He begged me to help him survive. He told me I had to give him some money because the cartel enforcers were entirely ruthless, and they would never stop hunting him until they collected every single penny of their debt. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping creature trespassing on my property. I did not tell him that I had just purchased his entire syndicate debt an hour ago at the downtown cigar lounge. I did not reveal that I was the very financial monster he was currently terrified of facing. That specific revelation required a much more public stage to maximize the psychological damage. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and held my thumb hovering directly over the emergency dial button. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to get off my property before I summoned the police to violently enforce the restraining order. Brian scrambled to his feet, tripping over the heavy hem of his own coat. He stumbled backward down the concrete steps, clutching the 2 legal documents against his chest like a fragile paper shield. He practically crawled back to his cheap rental car. He threw himself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped recklessly out of the driveway without even turning on his headlights. I stood alone on the dark porch and watched the red taillights disappear down the quiet street. The physical perimeter was now entirely secure. My daughter and my grandson were safely shielded behind impenetrable layers of legal armor and reinforced steel. Brian was currently driving aimlessly through the night, completely broke, homeless, and utterly terrified of a criminal organization. But a cornered animal is still highly dangerous. I knew Brian was a coward, but he had an older brother who worked in a powerful position of state authority. A desperate man with no money will always try to weaponize his last remaining family connection to strike back at his enemies. I turned around, unlocked the new deadbolt, and stepped inside the quiet, empty house, entirely prepared to face whatever corrupt, bureaucratic counterattack his brother was going to launch the very next morning. The sun rose over the fortified suburban house, casting long, cold shadows across the driveway. I had not slept a single minute. I sat alone at the kitchen island, drinking bitter black coffee and watching the digital feeds from the new high-definition security cameras I had installed before dawn. Upstairs, Natalie was finally waking from the heavy chemical fog. She was weak, confused, and traumatized, but she was safe behind locked steel deadbolts. Leo was asleep in his own bed, completely unaware of the absolute war raging around him. I knew Brian was desperate. I knew he was broke, homeless, and utterly terrified of the syndicate enforcers hunting him down. But a cornered rat will always bite, and Brian had one final poisoned tooth left in his jaw. At exactly 9 in the morning, a plain white sedan parked at the curb directly in front of my property. It was not a police cruiser, and it was not the syndicate. Two people stepped out of the vehicle, a man and a woman, both wearing cheap, ill-fitting suits and carrying thick manila folders. They walked up the driveway with the heavy, arrogant strides of government bureaucrats, who were entirely used to kicking down doors and terrifying vulnerable families. I watched them approach the reinforced front porch through the monitor. I set my coffee mug down, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped out into the cold morning air, pulling the heavy door firmly shut behind me. I did not invite them inside. The woman flashed a state identification badge and introduced herself as a senior investigator for the Department of Child Protective Services. She spoke with a rehearsed, mechanical coldness designed to intimidate. She told me they were executing an emergency removal order for my 4-year-old grandson. She claimed her office had received a credible, verified hotline report of severe domestic abuse and child endangerment occurring on this property. She demanded immediate physical access to the child and told me that any interference whatsoever would result in my immediate arrest for obstructing a state investigation. I did not panic, and I did not raise my voice. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared. I held out my hand and demanded to see the physical removal order. The male investigator smirked, handed me a stapled packet of official papers, and told me to read it quickly because they were taking the boy right now. I read the document with the cold, analytical precision of an auditor examining a fraudulent corporate ledger. The report was an absolute masterpiece of fabricated lies. It claimed I was a severely violent alcoholic who had violently assaulted my daughter the previous night. It stated that I had driven Brian out of the house in a drunken rage and was currently holding my grandson hostage in a barricaded structure. The narrative included fake testimonies from anonymous neighbors claiming they heard screaming and glass breaking. It explicitly stated I was an immediate physical threat to the minor and that my daughter was completely incapacitated due to my physical abuse. But the most important piece of information was located at the very bottom of the second page. I looked at the authorizing signature line. The emergency removal order had been expedited, approved, and signed by a regional district supervisor named Philip. Philip was Brian's older brother. The strategy became instantly clear in my mind. Brian was entirely blocked by the family court restraining order. He could not come within 1,000 feet of the house or his son without being arrested by the police. But if his brother abused his administrative power to seize Leo and place him in a temporary anonymous state foster home, Brian could easily bypass my perimeter. He could file an emergency petition with the state as the concerned biological father claim I was a dangerous lunatic and take physical custody of Leo directly from the foster care system. Once he had the boy, he would disappear across state lines and use his son as a human shield against the cartel debt. The male investigator stepped forward and reached aggressively for the brass doorknob behind me. He told me my time was up and they were going inside to secure the child. I shifted my weight and planted myself firmly in front of the door, completely blocking his path. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him if he touched that door handle, I would have him federally indicted for criminal trespassing. He laughed a short, arrogant laugh and told me a grandfather could not overrule a state child welfare mandate. The front door opened behind me. Vincent stepped out onto the porch wearing a pristine tailored suit and holding his heavy leather briefcase. He had slept in the guest room precisely for this kind of corrupt bureaucratic ambush. Vincent did not introduce himself politely. He immediately demanded their employee identification numbers and asked them if they were fully prepared to lose their state pensions and face federal prison time today. The two social workers took a sudden step back entirely unprepared to face a hostile corporate attorney on a routine morning grab. Vincent pulled a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. He handed them the emergency family court restraining order that explicitly barred Brian from having any physical or legal contact with Leo. Then he handed them a certified stamped copy of the comprehensive medical toxicology report from the hospital. Vincent pointed a sharp finger at the female investigator and told her to read the blood results. He explained that the only person who had abused my daughter and grandson was the biological father who had intentionally poisoned his family and was currently fleeing a massive syndicate gambling debt. Vincent did not stop there. He leaned forward and verbally dismantled their entire operation. He stated that the removal order they were holding was generated entirely through administrative fraud by an actively involved family member. He told them that Philip had explicitly violated severe federal conflict of interest protocols by authorizing an emergency investigation into his own nephew to facilitate a kidnapping. Vincent warned them that if they attempted to enforce a blatantly fraudulent document, he would personally file a massive civil rights lawsuit against both of them as individuals effectively bankrupting their families before the state could even offer a legal defense. The arrogant confidence completely drained from the two investigators. Their faces turned pale as they looked at the undeniable hospital records and the superior court restraining order. They looked down at the signature of their supervisor and realized they had been weaponized. They had been blindly sent to do the dirty work of a corrupt boss who was trying to help his brother steal a child. The female investigator swallowed hard, closed her manila folder, and took a rapid step down the concrete stairs. She nervously told her partner they needed to return to the regional office immediately to verify the chain of command and consult their legal department. I stood on the porch and watched them walk rapidly back to their unmarked sedan. They threw their cars into drive and sped away, terrified of the legal trap they had almost stepped into. But the war was far from over. Brian and Philip had just escalated the conflict from a bitter domestic dispute to severe public corruption. Philip actually thought he could use his government badge to break my family apart and steal my grandson. He believed his administrative state authority made him completely untouchable and immune to consequences. I walked back into the house and closed the heavy steel door, locking the deadbolt behind me. I looked at Vincent. We had successfully repelled the immediate physical threat, but a corrupt government official is a highly dangerous enemy to leave breathing. Philip had abused the very system designed to protect vulnerable children just to protect a degenerate gambler. I told Vincent we were no longer just playing defense. It was time to completely annihilate the corrupt brother and tear his entire public career down to the studs. I picked up my phone and prepared to take the medical evidence directly to the one place a corrupt bureaucrat fears more than anything else. The unmarked sedan carrying the corrupt social workers disappeared around the corner, but the threat they represented hung heavily in the cold morning air. Brian had successfully weaponized a state agency. He was no longer just a desperate man running from a gambling debt. He was actively using the government to bypass my physical security and kidnap my grandson. I turned away from the reinforced front door and walked back into the kitchen where Vincent was already packing his leather briefcase. We had successfully repelled the immediate ambush, but defense does not win wars. Defense merely delays the inevitable. I told Vincent it was time to take the absolute undeniable proof of Brian's crimes directly to the top of the judicial food chain. We were going to completely bypass the local police and the corrupt Child Protective Services hierarchy. We were going to cut the head off the snake. I grabbed my keys and we drove straight to Memorial Hospital. Natalie was safe in her secured recovery room under the watch of the private guards, but my focus was entirely on the medical records department on the ground floor. I had forced the attending physician to order a comprehensive legal toxicology screen the night before. Standard hospital bureaucracy usually takes days to process and release those specific records, but I did not have days. I walked up to the thick glass window of the records department and slid my irrevocable medical proxy document across the counter. The clerk looked at the paper and then looked up at me lazily, stating that toxicology results took 72 hours to clear the administrative review board. Vincent stepped forward and placed his hands flat on the counter. He spoke with the terrifying calm of a man who dismantles corporations for sport. He informed the clerk that she was currently impeding a federal criminal investigation involving the attempted murder of a minor. He pulled a blank subpoena form from his briefcase and told her that if she did not physically print those certified lab results in the next 60 seconds, he would have a federal marshal return in an hour to confiscate her entire computer system. The clerk swallowed hard, her eyes darting between Vincent's cold stare and the heavy legal documents. She turned around, typed frantically on her keyboard, and retrieved a thick stack of sealed envelopes from the secure printer. We walked out to my truck, and I tore open the sealed envelopes in the parking lot. I am not a doctor, but I spent 40 years reading complex data sets. The numbers printed on the laboratory letterhead were absolutely devastating. The screen confirmed the presence of a heavy generic central nervous system depressant, but it was the dosage levels that made my blood run cold. Natalie had ingested an amount so massive it bordered on a lethal overdose. The chemical concentration in Leo's small body was lower, but still severe enough to cause permanent respiratory failure if the paramedics had arrived even 10 minutes later. Brian did not just want them asleep. He was completely indifferent to whether they lived or died as long as he had enough time to steal the money and escape. I handed the reports to Vincent. He read the exact concentrations and his jaw tightened. He told me this was no longer a simple domestic violence case or a financial fraud dispute. This was a documented case of premeditated attempted homicide and severe child endangerment. We got into the truck and drove away from the hospital, heading straight toward the towering stone columns of the Superior County Courthouse. We were not going to the local precinct. Local detectives have to file reports, wait for approvals, and navigate department politics. Furthermore, we knew Brian's brother Philip held a senior supervisory position within the state family welfare system. Philip could easily make a few phone calls to corrupt local officials and stall an arrest warrant, or bury the evidence in administrative red tape. We needed a judge with absolute untouchable authority. We needed a magistrate who could look at the evidence and issue a completely unappealable direct order. Vincent used his extensive network of former prosecutor contacts to bypass the massive scheduling queue. He secured an immediate emergency ex parte hearing with Judge Bennett, a veteran Superior Court magistrate known for his absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding child abuse and public corruption. We were escorted by a bailiff through the quiet marble hallways and ushered into the judge's private chambers. The room was lined with heavy legal volumes and smelled of old paper and polished wood. Judge Bennett sat behind a massive desk, looking severely annoyed by the sudden interruption to his morning docket. Vincent did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and began laying the documents perfectly flat on the judge's desk. He presented the case not as a family dispute, but as a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy involving a flight risk. First, Vincent placed the forged $400,000 mortgage document on the desk, establishing the massive financial motive. He explained that Brian was attempting to liquidate marital assets to flee an illegal gambling syndicate. Second, Vincent placed my laptop on the desk and opened the flash drive. He played the high-definition nanny cam footage. Judge Bennett watched in absolute stunned silence as the digital video clearly showed Brian crushing the heavy white pills into Natalie's coffee and forcing the contaminated juice box into my grandson's hands. The The visual evidence was completely irrefutable. It was the cold, calculated mechanics of a monster poisoning his own family. Third, Vincent placed the certified hospital toxicology reports right next to the laptop. He pointed directly to the lethal dosage numbers verified by the state laboratory. He stated that the victims were currently lying in a secure trauma ward recovering from severe chemical poisoning. Judge Bennett leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his face pale with suppressed rage. He looked at the mountain of undeniable evidence and stated that he was going to authorize an immediate felony arrest warrant. But Vincent held up his hand and told the judge there was one final crucial piece of the puzzle, the most dangerous piece. Vincent pulled the fabricated Child Protective Services removal order from his briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of the desk. He pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the page. He explained to the judge that exactly 2 hours ago, state social workers attempted to physically seize the poisoned child from my secured home. Vincent revealed that the emergency removal order was fraudulently generated and authorized by Philip, who was Brian's biological older brother. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Judge Bennett was a man who dedicated his life to the integrity of the legal system. Seeing a state agency blatantly weaponized to facilitate a kidnapping and protect an attempted murderer crossed a line that he could not tolerate. The judge picked up the fabricated removal order, and his eyes narrowed into a terrifying glare. He realized that Brian was not just fleeing, he was actively using the government to attack the victims. Judge Bennett pulled a heavy stack of blank warrants from his desk drawer. He did not issue a standard bench warrant. He grabbed his pen and aggressively filled out a no-knock immediate execution felony arrest warrant. He checked the boxes for attempted homicide, grand larceny, severe child endangerment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He stamped the bottom of the document with the heavy official seal of the Superior Court. The judge handed the executed warrant directly to Vincent. He ordered us to take the document straight to the State Police Fugitive Task Force, entirely bypassing the local municipal police. He stated that Brian was now officially classified as an extreme flight risk and a violent threat to the public. He also promised to make a personal phone call to the State Inspector General regarding the corrupt actions of the Child Protective Services supervisor. We walked out of the courthouse and stepped back into the cold daylight. The legal counterstrike was flawlessly executed. Brian had tried to use his brother to steal my grandson. In return, I had just turned him into one of the most wanted fugitives in the state. He could no longer hide in cheap rental cars or skulk around suburban neighborhoods. Every state trooper, every highway patrol officer, and every federal agent at the border was about to receive his photograph. The net was cast, and it was pulling tight. Vincent and I walked out of the Superior Courthouse with the freshly inked felony arrest warrant secured inside my leather briefcase. The cold midday sun offered absolutely no warmth as we climbed back into my truck. I placed the briefcase on the center console and started the engine. Judge Bennett had promised to alert the State Fugitive Task Force, but I knew from decades of corporate investigations that government gears turn incredibly slowly. A bureaucratic task force requires briefings, resource allocations, and chain-of-command approvals before they ever put boots on the ground. Brian did not operate on a bureaucratic timeline. He operated on the pure, unadulterated adrenaline of a hunted animal. He knew his brother had failed to secure Leo. He knew the protective perimeter around my daughter was impenetrable. He knew he was completely out of options. I drove toward the highway and told Vincent to open his laptop. I explained that a man who owes $500,000 to a violent gambling syndicate does not stay in the city to hire a defense attorney. He runs as far and as fast as his remaining resources will allow. I knew I had frozen the massive $400,000 offshore wire transfer. I knew I had secured the diamond jewelry he intended to pawn. but a seasoned parasite always maintains a hidden emergency fund. I asked Vincent to pull up the complete financial disclosure profile we had compiled on Brian. We needed to find the tiny overlooked accounts, the low-limit credit cards, or the digital payment applications that a desperate man might use to purchase a commercial escape. Vincent scanned the digital records while I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic. 10 minutes later, he found an anomaly. Brian had a secondary digital banking application tied to a prepaid debit account. It was the type of account usually used for minor online purchases to avoid exposing primary banking credentials. I called my contact at the bank fraud division and provided the routing information, asking them to run a real-time query on that specific prepaid card. The response came back in less than 5 minutes. Exactly 1 hour ago, Brian had completely drained the remaining $800 on that card to purchase a single one-way economy class ticket. The destination was Cancun, Mexico. The flight was scheduled to depart from the regional international airport in exactly 90 minutes. Mexico was the perfect, desperate choice. It offered immediate geographical distance and a chaotic tourist infrastructure where a man with cash could easily slip off the grid and disappear into the sprawling southern continent. But commercial air travel is the absolute worst environment for a wanted fugitive. Airports are enclosed federal fortresses heavily monitored by overlapping layers of local, state, and national security agencies. I did not call the local police precinct to report his location. I dialed the Direct Emergency Operations Center for the Transportation Security Administration at the International Airport. I identified myself and immediately demanded to speak to the federal duty commander. When the commander came on the line, I informed him that a high-risk fugitive with an active Superior Court felony warrant for attempted homicide and severe financial fraud was currently inside his secure perimeter. I emailed the high-resolution digital copy of Judge Bennett's signed warrant directly to the commander's secure server. The federal response was instantaneous. The commander confirmed receipt of the warrant, verified the judicial seal, and assured me that the entire airport security grid was now actively hunting the passenger. I told Vincent to guide me to the international terminal. I did not want to sit in my truck and wait for a phone call confirming the arrest. I wanted to witness the exact moment the trap violently snapped shut. I wanted to see the arrogant entitlement completely drained from Brian's face when he realized his entire life was over. We parked in the short-term parking garage and walked rapidly into the massive glass and steel departure atrium. The building was teeming with thousands of travelers dragging heavy luggage and rushing toward the security checkpoints. The departure board suspended high above the concourse listed the flight to Cancun as actively boarding at Gate 42. Because we did not have valid boarding passes, we could not physically walk through the metal detectors and approach the departure gate. However, the architectural layout of the international terminal featured a massive elevated glass observation deck built specifically for families to watch international flights depart. Vincent and I took the escalator up to the viewing platform. The deck provided an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire secure concourse below, including Gate 42. I stood close to the heavy glass and scanned the sprawling sea of passengers waiting near the boarding doors. It took me less than 30 seconds to locate him. Brian was standing near the front of the priority boarding lane. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He constantly shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing nervously over his shoulder every few seconds. He had abandoned his rental car and arrived with absolutely no luggage. He carried nothing but the heavy winter coat on his back and his dark blue passport clutched tightly in his fist. He truly believed he had slipped through the cracks of the system. He thought the local police were too slow and the state bureaucracy was too tangled to catch him before the plane took off. He looked up at the digital clock above the gate and a sickening smile of relief spread across his pale face as the final boarding announcement echoed over the public address system. The gate agent opened the glass doors, and the long line of passengers began to shuffle forward. Brian took a deep breath, stepping closer and closer to the scanning podium, believing he was just seconds away from total freedom. I watched with cold, analytical precision as he stepped up to the counter and handed his boarding pass and passport to the airline agent. The agent smiled politely and scanned the barcode on his paper ticket. The machine did not emit the standard pleasant chime confirming his seat. Instead, the terminal screen flashed a solid, bright red and immediately locked the system. The agent looked confused for a fraction of a second before glancing down at the specific alert code on her monitor. Her training kicked in immediately. She maintained a calm, professional demeanor and politely asked Brian to step to the side, claiming there was a minor seating discrepancy that needed to be resolved with the flight crew. Brian instantly panicked. His eyes darted toward the jet bridge and he aggressively reached across the counter to grab his passport. But the agent had already pulled his travel documents safely behind the protective barrier. Before Brian could raise his voice or attempt to run the federal trap was violently sprung. 6 heavily armed federal airport police officers materialized from the surrounding crowd. They had been silently staging in the nearby terminal shops and passenger seating areas, blending in perfectly until the target was entirely isolated at the gate. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute tactical dominance. They did not ask him politely to place his hands behind his back. They swarmed him instantly. 2 officers grabbed his arms, twisting them sharply backward, while a 3rd officer kicked his legs out from under him. They tackled Brian forcefully onto the hard, polished floor of the terminal. The heavy, sickening thud of his body hitting the ground echoed loudly over the ambient noise of the concourse. Hundreds of waiting passengers gasped loudly and stepped back in pure shock. Mothers quickly pulled their children away, shielding their eyes as the armed officers pinned Brian to the floor. An officer drove his knee firmly into Brian's back, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Brian screamed in absolute blind terror, thrashing violently against the officers and begging them to let him go. He shouted hysterically that he had a flight to catch and that they were making a massive mistake. He cried out that he was an innocent man trying to take a vacation. The commanding officer ignored his pathetic screaming and hauled Brian roughly up to his feet. The officer spoke with a booming voice that carried across the entire crowded terminal, announcing that Brian was being placed under federal arrest for a Superior Court felony warrant involving attempted homicide and grand larceny. The word homicide rippled through the silent crowd of stunned travelers. The people staring at him no longer saw a stressed businessman running late for a flight. They saw a violent, dangerous criminal being brought to justice. The ultimate public humiliation was absolute and completely devastating. Brian hung his head, his face burning with deep shame as hundreds of strangers whispered, pointed, and recorded his arrest on their phones. As the officers began to aggressively march him away from the gate, Brian frantically scanned the upper levels of the massive terminal, looking for any sympathetic face or any sign of an escape route. His panicked eyes swept across the elevated glass observation deck and locked directly onto mine. I stood perfectly still, leaning casually against the metal railing, looking down at him with an expression of absolute cold finality. I did not smile. I did not gesture. I simply stared into his soul. In that single fleeting second of unbroken eye contact, Brian understood absolutely everything. He understood that the frozen offshore account, the ruined locks on his house, the failed Child Protective Services ambush, and the armed federal officers swarming him at the airport were not random strokes of bad luck. They were the highly calculated, precise strikes of a single retired auditor who had systematically dismantled his entire existence piece by piece. The crushing realization hit him so hard, his legs buckled slightly, and the federal officers had to physically drag him by his armpits toward the secure detention holding area. I turned away from the glass window, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure regarding the physical threat to my family. The flight to Mexico began boarding the remaining passengers without him. Brian's escape route was permanently severed. He was no longer a dangerous threat running loose in the world, capable of hurting my daughter or my grandson. He was a caged, terrified animal waiting for the slaughter. I walked back toward the escalators with Vincent walking silently beside me. We had to prepare for the final critical phase of the operation. Brian was currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, entirely broken and stripped of all his dignity and hope. It was time for me to walk into that interrogation room and force him to permanently surrender the very last thing he actually owned. The heavy steel door of the federal detention facility closed behind me with a loud metallic echo that vibrated down the long, sterile concrete corridor. The air inside the building was completely stagnant, smelling heavily of industrial floor wax and stale sweat. I walked closely beside a silent armed guard, following a faded yellow line painted on the floor toward the high-security interrogation wing. Vincent had remained in the public waiting area, sitting calmly on a hard plastic chair with his briefcase resting on his knees. He had used his extensive network of former federal prosecutor contacts to secure me exactly 30 minutes alone in a room with the prisoner. This was a massive deviation from standard legal protocol, but when you possess a lifetime of corporate leverage, you can easily open doors that are supposed to be permanently locked. The guard stopped in front of a solid gray door, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and motioned for me to step inside. The interrogation room was a small windowless concrete box, illuminated by a single harsh fluorescent light tube buzzing softly on the ceiling. In the center of the room sat a scratched steel table bolted directly into the floor, with two metal chairs facing each other. I sat down in the chair facing the door, unbuttoned my coat, and placed my leather briefcase flat on the cold metal surface. I did not have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, the door opened again, and two massive correction officers dragged Brian into the room. The physical transformation was absolutely stunning. The arrogant, entitled man who had stood on my front porch, wearing a tailored winter coat and smelling of expensive cologne, was entirely gone. Brian was now wearing a loose-fitting, bright orange paper jumpsuit. His wrists were secured in heavy steel handcuffs, attached to a thick chain wrapped tightly around his waist. His ankles were shackled, forcing him to shuffle his feet across the floor. His face was completely drained of color, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hair was wildly disheveled from being pinned to the floor at the airport. He looked like a terrified, broken animal. The guards pushed him roughly into the metal chair, secured his waist chain to an iron ring welded to the table, and walked out of the room, locking the door behind them. We were completely alone. Brian looked across the table at me, and his lower lip began to tremble violently. He expected a massive emotional explosion. He expected me to scream at him, to slam my fists against the table, and to demand a tearful apology for poisoning my daughter and my grandson. He immediately opened his mouth and started babbling in a high-pitched, frantic whisper. He claimed the pressure of his failing business had completely destroyed his mind. He swore he never intended to cause any permanent physical harm, and that he only wanted them to sleep soundly so he could pack his bags and leave without a traumatic argument. He begged me to understand that he was a victim of his own desperate circumstances. I did not speak a single word. I did not show a fraction of anger or sadness. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded neatly on top of my briefcase, simply staring directly into his bloodshot eyes. My absolute silence was a weapon far more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. He continued to offer pathetic excuses and apologies for another 2 minutes, but his voice grew weaker and weaker as he realized I was not absorbing a single word he said. The cold, empty void of my stare slowly crushed the last of his breath. He finally stopped talking and hung his head, crying softly into his chained hands. When the room fell completely silent, I popped the brass latches on my briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek black digital tablet. I woke the screen and slid the device slowly across the scratched metal table until it rested directly in front of his chained hands. I told him to open his eyes and look closely at the monitor. Brian wiped his face on the shoulder of his orange jumpsuit and leaned forward. The tablet was not displaying a standard website. It was logged directly into a highly secure internal banking portal, showing a comprehensive overview of multiple hidden domestic accounts. These were the secret emergency funds, the shadow cryptocurrency wallets, and the untraceable prepaid accounts he had spent years hiding from my daughter. These were the safety nets he believed no one else in the world knew about. I spoke with a voice like crushed ice. I explained that when I met with the Azure Oceanic Syndicate representative at the cigar lounge, I did not just purchase his debt. I also purchased his entire financial dossier. The cartel had meticulously documented every single penny he had ever hidden to ensure they had adequate collateral for his gambling losses. I pointed to the flashing numbers on the tablet screen. I told him that the documents he signed with the syndicate included an absolute confession of judgment. Because I was now the sole legal owner of that debt, I had the immediate unilateral authority to execute those judgments without any further court approval. Brian watched the screen in absolute horror as the live balances on his secret accounts began to systematically drop. The numbers flashed red and drained rapidly in real time as my holding company initiated the automated asset seizures. $3,000 from a hidden checking account vanished. $10,000 from a digital wallet evaporated. His entire secret financial existence was being ruthlessly deleted right in front of his eyes. He realized he was not just broke, but that he would never be allowed to own a single dollar ever again. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out 2 crisp legal documents. I placed them on the table right next to the tablet. I tapped the first document and told him it was a comprehensive typed confession. It explicitly detailed his premeditated plan to commit grand larceny mortgage fraud and the intentional chemical poisoning of a minor. I tapped the second document and explained it was an irrevocable permanent surrender of all parental rights, granting my daughter sole absolute custody of Leo and completely severing his legal relationship to the child forever. Brian looked at the papers and shook his head, sobbing quietly. He stammered that if he signed a full confession to attempted homicide and federal fraud, he would spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. He told me he would never survive in a place like that. He begged me to show him just a tiny amount of mercy for the sake of the family. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. I told him he completely misunderstood the current dynamic of the room. I explained that the confession was not a punishment. The confession was a rescue raft. I laid out his exact reality. I told him that if he signed the documents, he would indeed go to federal prison. He would be locked in a small concrete cell for decades, but he would have 3 meals a day, a cot to sleep on, and heavily armed federal guards protecting him from the outside world. He would be entirely safe from the syndicate. Then I laid out the alternative. I told him that if he refused to sign the documents, I would walk out into the hallway and instruct Vincent to immediately drop all state and federal charges against him. I told him he would be completely legally cleared and the guards would release him from this facility in exactly 1 hour. I watched his eyes widen in confusion before the true absolute terror finally clicked in his mind. I lowered my voice to a dark whisper. I told him that he would walk out of the front doors of the detention center a completely free man. But he would walk out wearing nothing but the clothes on his back. He would have absolutely zero money, zero credit, and no passport. And most importantly, he would walk directly into the visitor parking lot, where the enforcers from the Azure Oceanic Syndicate were already waiting for him. I told him the cartel did not care that I bought the debt. They were furious that he had tried to run, and they were extremely eager to send a violent public message to their other debtors. I placed a black ink pen on top of the legal papers. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to choose his fate. He could choose the cold concrete walls of a federal prison, or he could choose the absolute violent certainty of the syndicate waiting in the parking lot. He looked at the tablet screen where his final secret account balance officially hit 0. He was a man completely stripped of his armor, his leverage, and his illusions. He was nothing but a terrified coward staring at his own grave. Brian did not hesitate for another second. His chained hands trembled violently as he picked up the pen. He practically tore the paper as he scribbled his signature across the bottom of the complete criminal confession. He quickly flipped to the second document and signed away his son without shedding a single tear. He dropped the pen on the table and pushed the documents toward me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. He looked at me and actually begged me to make sure the guards kept him locked inside the secure federal block. I gathered the signed papers and placed them carefully inside my briefcase. I picked up the digital tablet and locked the latches. I stood up from the metal chair, looking down at the ruined, pathetic creature chained to the table. I told him he would never see the sky as a free man again, and I promised him I would never think about him for the rest of my life. I turned my back to him, walked out of the interrogation room, and signaled the guard to lock the heavy steel door, permanently shutting Brian into the dark concrete tomb he had built for himself. The heavy black pen clattered against the scratched metal table, slipping from Brian's trembling fingers. He pushed the 2 signed legal documents across the cold steel surface, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted a dozen miles. The ink was still wet on the paper. The complete criminal confession and the absolute surrender of all parental rights were now officially executed. I picked up the documents and inspected the signatures. They were frantic and sloppy, reflecting the pure terror pumping through his veins, but they were completely legally binding. I slid them carefully into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. The physical and legal barrier separating him from my daughter and my grandson was finally complete and impenetrable. Brian sat slumped in the metal chair, his bright orange paper jumpsuit clinging to his sweating shoulders. He had chosen the safety of a federal prison over the violent retribution of the gambling syndicate waiting for him in the parking lot. But the mind of a parasite never truly stops looking for a host. Even in the absolute depths of his total defeat, his survival instinct began to aggressively claw at the walls of his reality. He knew he was going to prison, but the stark, terrifying difference between a minimum security facility and a maximum security concrete tomb depended entirely on the quality of his legal representation. And quality legal representation requires liquid capital. He looked up at me, wiping his nose on his sleeve. His eyes darted around the small, windowless room as he desperately tried to calculate his remaining leverage. He knew his offshore wire transfer was permanently frozen by the Federal Banking Commission. He knew I had systematically seized his secret domestic accounts using the syndicate debt contracts. He was completely broke on paper, but he still believed he held one final hidden card. He took a deep, shaky breath and shifted his weight against the heavy iron waist chains, trying to manufacture a posture of confidence. He dropped his voice to a low, conspiratorial whisper, completely ignoring the reality that he had just confessed to attempted homicide minutes prior. He told me he knew he was going away for a very long time, He said he understood why I did what I did to protect Natalie. But then he tried to pivot, offering what he thought was a highly lucrative compromise. He told me about the dark green canvas duffel bag. He confessed that before he gave Natalie the poisoned coffee, he had completely emptied her heavy wooden jewelry box. He listed the specific items with greedy, precise detail. The diamond tennis bracelet, the antique pearl necklace, the heavy sapphire earrings. Brian claimed the total market value of those stolen stones was easily over $250,000. He leaned forward as far as the heavy chains would allow, his eyes gleaming with a pathetic, desperate hope. He told me he knew I had secured the house and changed the locks. He assumed the green duffel bag was still sitting exactly where he hid it, in the back of the master bedroom closet. He offered me a deal. He told me I could keep 75% of the total value to help Natalie recover from the trauma and support Leo. All he asked in return was that I liquidate the remaining 25% and use the cash to hire a private defense attorney for his upcoming federal trial. He actually believed he was negotiating from a position of strength. He thought he was throwing me a financial bone, offering me stolen family heirlooms in exchange for a slightly more comfortable prison sentence. He begged me not to let him be assigned a public defender, claiming he would never survive a single week in the general population block without high-priced legal armor protecting him from the prosecution. I sat perfectly still and let him finish his entire pathetic pitch. I watched the desperate hope swell in his chest, inflating his ego just a fraction of an inch. I wanted him to feel that tiny spark of optimism so I could extinguish it with absolute total prejudice. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, mechanical rhythm of an auditor reading a zero-balance ledger. I told him he was completely incorrect about the location of the green canvas duffel bag. I explained that I did not leave $250,000 in untraceable liquid assets sitting in an empty suburban house. I told him that exactly 1 hour after the emergency locksmith drilled out the old deadbolts, I walked up to the master bedroom and retrieved the bag from the closet floor. Brian's face fell slightly, but he quickly recovered, nodding his head. He assumed I had simply locked the bag inside a secure bank vault for safekeeping. He told me that was a smart move and reiterated that we could easily pawn the stones by the end of the week to secure the legal retainer. I shook my head slowly. I told him I did not put the jewelry in a bank vault. I explained that those specific diamonds and pearls were purchased over the years to celebrate milestones in my daughter's life. They were symbols of her professional success and her family history. Because he had contaminated them with his violent greed and handled them while planning her murder, they were no longer symbols of joy. They were blood money. I told him I refused to let my daughter ever wear jewelry that had been packed in a bag by the man who intentionally poisoned her. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit coat and pulled out a single folded sheet of thick blue paper. I placed it on the steel table and unfolded it deliberately, pushing it across the scratched surface toward his chained hands. I told him that at 8 o'clock this morning, while he was frantically trying to board a flight to Mexico, I drove to the downtown headquarters of the State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I walked directly into the executive director's office and placed the green canvas duffel bag on her desk. I brought an independent certified gemologist with me to formally appraise the entire collection on the spot. I told Brian I executed an irrevocable charitable trust transfer, donating every single diamond, every pearl, and every sapphire directly to the charity. Brian stared at the piece of blue paper on the table. It was the official notarized tax receipt from the charity organization. The receipt explicitly stated that the massive donation was made in the name of Natalie to directly fund emergency legal services and secure housing for women fleeing violent and abusive spouses. I watched his eyes scan the official stamp and the authorizing signatures. The reality of the document hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. His breathing completely stopped. The very assets he had stolen to fund his own cowardly escape from the syndicate had been entirely liquidated to fund the escape of other victims. I leaned over the table and completely shattered his final delusion. I told him the jewelry was gone forever. The offshore money was permanently frozen. His domestic accounts were entirely seized. I told him he had absolutely zero leverage, zero assets, and zero family. I promised him that when his federal trial began, he would be standing in the courtroom with a completely overworked, exhausted public defender who would advise him to take whatever maximum punitive sentence the judge decided to hand down. I told him he would rot in a standard concrete cell without a single dollar on his commissary books for the rest of his natural life. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The absolute totality of his destruction was finally complete. He squeezed his eyes shut and let his head fall heavily onto the metal table, the steel chains rattling loudly against the iron ring. He was no longer a man. He was an empty, hollow shell waiting to be discarded by the justice system. I stood up from the chair and picked up my briefcase. I did not say goodbye. I walked over to the heavy steel door and knocked twice. The guard immediately unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I stepped out into the sterile concrete hallway, leaving Brian weeping silently in the dark room. Vincent was waiting for me in the lobby, holding his own briefcase. He looked at my face and knew the internal war with Brian was permanently finished. We walked out of the federal detention facility and stepped into the cold afternoon air. The parasite was fully excised, but the corrupt bureaucratic machinery that tried to help him was still fully operational. I looked at Vincent and told him we were not going home yet. We had a massive arsenal of medical evidence and a fraudulent state document. It was time to hunt down the corrupt supervisor who had tried to steal my grandson. It was time to completely destroy Philip. The drive back from the federal detention facility was quiet. Vincent sat in the passenger seat, reviewing his notes, while I watched the highway unroll before us. Brian was securely locked in a concrete cell permanently removed from our lives. But my mind was not at rest. A seasoned auditor understands that catching the embezzler is only half the job. You must also identify the internal weakness that allowed the breach to happen in the first place, and you must completely destroy it. That weakness was Philip. Brian's older brother had used his senior supervisory position at the State Child Protective Services to authorize a fraudulent kidnapping. He had weaponized the very government agency designed to protect vulnerable children just to help a degenerate gambler steal my grandson. As long as Philip held a badge and a state pension, he remained a dangerous parasite. I parked my truck in the driveway of my fortified home. Natalie was resting comfortably upstairs with Leo. The private security team was still stationed outside. I walked into my home office with Vincent and locked the door. I told him we were going to completely dismantle Philip's public career and put him in a cell right next to his brother. Vincent smiled a cold, calculating smile and opened his laptop. He explained that a corrupt bureaucrat like Philip rarely commits a massive administrative felony on his very first try. The forged emergency removal order he signed against me was incredibly sloppy. It reeked of an arrogant official who was completely accustomed to breaking the rules without ever facing any consequences. We spent the next 48 hours aggressively digging into Philip's digital paper trail. Vincent utilized his deep network of former federal prosecutors and state investigators to quietly pull the public records of every single custody case Philip had personally supervised over the last 5 years. We were looking for a specific pattern of bureaucratic manipulation. I applied the exact same forensic accounting principles I used to track stolen corporate funds. Instead of tracking missing money, I tracked missing due process. By the morning of the third day, the pattern became glaringly obvious. We discovered 14 separate cases where Philip had expedited the removal of children from entirely capable single mothers. In every single one of those suspicious cases, the opposing custody party was a wealthy father who had hired a specific, highly priced family law attorney. Philip was not just helping his brother. He was running a quiet, lucrative extortion ring. He was using his state authority to manufacture fake abuse reports, intimidating vulnerable mothers into surrendering custody in exchange for under-the-table kickbacks from corrupt lawyers. My grandson's forged removal order was simply a desperate favor for a family member, but it was the single loose thread that was going to unravel his entire criminal enterprise. We did not take our findings to the local police department. Local detectives often hesitate to investigate state officials due to complicated jurisdictional politics. We also completely bypassed the Internal Affairs Department at Child Protective Services. Internal investigations are notoriously slow, and they often allow the corrupt official to quietly resign with their full pension intact to avoid a massive public relations scandal. I did not want Philip to quietly resign. I wanted him to be publicly humiliated, legally destroyed, and entirely stripped of his freedom. Vincent compiled every piece of evidence into a massive 300-page dossier. It included the fabricated reports, the suspicious case timelines, the financial discrepancies, and the undeniable medical toxicology reports from Natalie's hospital stay. We placed the dossier into a heavy sealed envelope and drove directly to the state capitol building. We bypassed the standard reception desks and walked straight into the executive suite of the State Inspector General. The Inspector General is an independent oversight authority with the absolute power to investigate and arrest corrupt government officials without requiring any departmental permission. Vincent personally handed the heavy dossier to the chief investigator of the Oversight Committee. He briefly explained the magnitude of the civil rights violations and the direct connection to an active attempted homicide investigation involving my daughter. The chief investigator opened the file, read the first 10 pages, and immediately picked up his secure telephone to mobilize a state tactical response team. The gears of absolute justice began to turn with terrifying speed. I did not want to miss the final execution of the trap. Vincent and I drove to the Regional Child Protective Services building and parked across the street from the main entrance. We sat in the warm cab of my truck and watched the front doors. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, 4 unmarked black sports utility vehicles aggressively pulled up to the curb, blocking the employee crosswalk. A dozen state agents wearing heavy tactical vests with the words Inspector General printed in bright yellow letters rushed out of the vehicles and stormed into the glass lobby. I sat perfectly still, watching the large office windows on the 3rd floor. I could see the sudden panic erupting among the office staff as the armed agents locked down the entire floor. 15 minutes later, the front doors of the building slid open. The state agents walked out in a tight, tactical formation. Right in the middle of the group was Philip. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable supervisor who thought he could dictate the fate of my family. He was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, and his hands were secured tightly behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. His face was completely pale, and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated shock. Dozens of his co-workers and subordinate social workers stood on the sidewalk, watching in absolute stunned silence as their boss was publicly marched out of the building like a common street criminal. The agents had completely seized his office computers, his personal cell phone, and boxes of physical case files. They pushed Philip roughly into the back of one of the unmarked vehicles. He looked out through the tinted glass, and his eyes desperately scanned the street. For a brief second, he made direct eye contact with me, sitting in my truck across the intersection. I did not wave, and I did not smile. I just stared at him with cold, absolute finality. He realized in that exact moment that the old man he had casually tried to bully was the architect of his total destruction. The vehicles turned on their flashing red and blue lights, and sped away toward the state holding facility. The fallout was immediate and incredibly devastating for him. The next morning, the State Welfare Department issued a public statement entirely terminating his employment and freezing his state pension, pending a massive criminal probe. The Inspector General officially indicted him on 22 separate felony counts, including official misconduct, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, civil rights violations, and evidence tampering. Because his crimes involved the abuse of a government position of trust, the state prosecutors announced they would seek the absolute maximum punitive sentence available under the law. Philip was officially denied bail due to the sheer magnitude of his public corruption and his obvious status as a flight risk. He was placed in a secure holding cell far away from his brother. Brian's very last line of defense, his powerful government connection, and his only hope for outside assistance was completely permanently eradicated. The two brothers who had arrogantly plotted to destroy my daughter and steal my grandson were now entirely isolated from the world, locked in concrete boxes, waiting for the federal and state judges to seal their fates. I started the engine of my truck and drove away from the state capitol building. The war was officially over. I had successfully audited the threat, tracked the vulnerabilities, and executed the necessary legal corrections. Every single parasite had been permanently removed from the host. I drove back toward the quiet suburban house, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. It was finally time to return home to help my daughter heal, to hold my grandson, and to start building a completely new life on a foundation of absolute safety and unbreakable trust. The heavy chemical fog finally began to lift on the morning of the fourth day. I was sitting in the vinyl chair beside the hospital bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my daughter's chest. The harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma ward had been dimmed, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Natalie slowly opened her eyes and blinked against the soft morning light filtering through the window blinds. The dark purple contusion on her jaw was beginning to fade into a dull yellow, but the physical trauma was secondary to the confusion clouding her vision. She looked around the sterile room, and then her eyes found mine. She did not panic. She simply reached out her pale, trembling hand, and I covered it completely with my own. It took several hours for her mind to fully process the fragmented memories of that terrible night. She remembered the bitter taste of the coffee and the sudden, terrifying vertigo that had pulled her down into the darkness. She remembered Brian standing over her, watching her collapse. When she finally asked me where her husband was, I did not sugarcoat the reality. I spoke with a calm, gentle certainty, assuring her that Brian was permanently gone. I told her he had attempted to steal her future to pay for his own catastrophic mistakes, but he had failed. I explained that she was entirely safe, that Leo was completely healthy and playing in the pediatric wing, and that the man who had hurt them would never be allowed to breathe free air again. Later that afternoon, Vincent walked into the hospital room carrying his familiar leather briefcase. He approached the bed with a deep, respectful silence, completely dropping his aggressive courtroom demeanor. He opened the briefcase and retrieved the thick stack of legal documents I had secured in the federal interrogation room. He placed Brian's signed criminal confession and the absolute surrender of parental rights directly on her lap. Natalie stared at the sloppy, terrified signatures of the man she had once trusted. The tears that rolled down her cheeks were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming relief. Vincent then handed her the finalized divorce petition. Natalie gripped the pen tightly and signed her name with a steady, fierce determination. In that single moment, the parasitic attachment was legally and permanently severed. We brought Natalie and Leo back to the suburban house 2 days later. The environment was completely transformed. The house was no longer a vulnerable target or a crime scene. It was a fortified sanctuary. The heavy steel deadbolts secured every entrance, and the new high-definition cameras monitored every angle of the property. But the most important change was the feeling in the air. The heavy toxic anxiety that Brian had carried into the home every single day was entirely absent. The house felt lighter and brighter. Natalie walked through the front door and took a deep breath of clean air, finally realizing that the oppressive weight of her marriage had been permanently lifted from her shoulders. With the physical safety of my family absolutely guaranteed, I turned my attention back to the massive financial wreckage Brian had left behind. The $400,000 from the fraudulent second mortgage was still securely trapped in the frozen internal holding account at the commercial bank. Because Brian had signed a full federal confession admitting to the forgery and the mortgage fraud, the entire lending contract was legally nullified. The predatory hard money lenders in Nevada attempted to fight the ruling, but Vincent threatened to expose their negligent underwriting practices to the Federal Banking Commission. They quickly backed down, releasing their fraudulent lien on my daughter's property. The house was completely free and clear, but I did not simply let the frozen money disappear back into the banking ether. As part of the federal criminal restitution settlement, I petitioned the court to seize the equivalent funds directly from Brian's remaining liquidated assets and the syndicate accounts I had successfully compromised. The federal magistrate agreed. I took that recovered $400,000 and established an ironclad, irrevocable generational trust. The trust was entirely protected from any future creditors' lawsuits or claims. I named Leo as the sole beneficiary and myself as the primary trustee. I structured the financial vehicle so perfectly that even if Brian managed to survive his prison sentence, he would never be able to touch a single penny of his son's wealth. The money he had tried to steal to save his own life became the permanent, unshakable foundation for my grandson's future. The wheels of the justice system ground forward with merciless efficiency. 3 months later, I sat in the back row of a crowded federal courtroom watching Brian face the magistrate. He looked completely hollowed out. His orange prison uniform hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his posture was entirely defeated. The overworked public defender stood beside him and offered no defense, relying entirely on the signed confession to request leniency. The federal judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. He recounted the horrific details of the poisoning and the calculated financial betrayal. The judge handed down a maximum consecutive sentence of 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Brian did not look back at me as the marshals led him away in heavy iron chains. He simply disappeared into the dark machinery of the penal system. The destruction of his corrupt brother followed shortly after. Philip stood trial in a state courtroom, facing the massive dossier of evidence we had delivered to the Inspector General. The state prosecutors aggressively dismantled his entire career, exposing the fraudulent removal orders and the corrupt legal kickbacks. Philip was stripped of his government pension, publicly disgraced, and sentenced to 15 years in a state correctional facility. The bureaucratic network he had weaponized to terrorize innocent families was completely eradicated. The syndicate, realizing their local enforcer network was under severe federal scrutiny, completely abandoned the region, absorbing the financial loss and retreating into the shadows. The entire hostile ecosystem that had threatened my family was entirely wiped off the map. Thus, 6 months passed, and the cold, heavy winter finally gave way to a bright, warm spring. I sat on the reinforced front porch of the suburban house drinking a cup of black coffee. The sun was shining brightly across the manicured green lawn. Down the street, children were riding their bicycles, and the neighborhood was perfectly peaceful. The digital security monitors inside the house were quiet, displaying nothing but clear skies and empty sidewalks. My ledger was completely balanced. The massive, terrifying deficit that had threatened to destroy everything I loved had been completely zeroed out. The front door opened behind me and Natalie stepped out onto the porch. She looked healthy, vibrant, and completely restored. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, and her voice was filled with a genuine lightness I had not heard in years. Leo ran out right behind her, clutching a small wooden toy truck, laughing loudly as he chased a butterfly across the grass. I watched my grandson play in the warm sunlight, entirely unburdened by the darkness of the past. He would grow up in a home filled with absolute security and unconditional love. He would never know the terrifying feeling of being hunted by a man who was supposed to protect him. I took a slow sip of my coffee and breathed in the fresh spring air. I had spent 4 decades of my life working as an auditor, hunting down thieves and unraveling complex corporate lies. I had built a career on the uncompromising belief that every action leaves a paper trail and every debt must eventually be paid. But looking at my daughter smiling in the sunlight and my grandson playing safely in the yard, I realized that my greatest professional achievement was never a bank audit. My ultimate masterpiece was the silent, calculated adjustment of my own family structure. A predator had walked into my home, expecting to find easy victims. He believed that his arrogance and his lies would protect him from the consequences of his extreme greed. He was completely wrong. He had underestimated the quiet, devastating power of a man who understands exactly how the world operates. I did not just defeat him. I dismantled his entire existence, seized his assets, trapped him in a cage, and used his own weapons to build an impenetrable fortress for the people I love. The parasite was permanently excised, and the new foundation was poured deep into the solid rock, entirely unbroken and ready to stand for generations. The most profound lesson drawn from this ordeal is that the most dangerous threats to a family rarely come from strangers in the dark. They come from those who sit at your dinner table masked by familiarity and entitlement. True protection requires more than just unconditional love. It demands absolute vigilance and the courage to see people exactly for who they are, not who you hope they will be. When a parasite reveals its true nature, you do not negotiate, and you do not offer second chances. Mercy without strict boundaries is simply a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. If you have ever had to become the villain in someone else's story to protect the people you love, share your experience in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of absolute justice.